It was supposed to be just another policy forum. Held in the Grand Hall of the Capitol Visitor Center, the event had been organized to showcase bipartisan dialogue on youth leadership and democratic engagement. Invitations were sent to seasoned legislators, civil rights advocates, and rising political voices. But behind the scenes, not everyone was welcome. At least not if they weren't handpicked. Karoline Leavitt had been invited not by the organizers, but by one of the sponsors, a Republican congressman who believed the forum needed at least one unapologetic conservative voice. At first, her name appeared in the event's lower lineups. But 2 days before the panel, her speaking slot vanished from the program. Administrative reshuffling, they called it. Karoline wasn't surprised. She'd seen it before, gatekeeping masquerading as protocol. Yet she showed up anyway, calm, prepared, and with a leather-bound folder in hand. Inside the venue, Nancy Pelosi presided over the opening remarks with signature poise. Her words were polished, rehearsed, and meticulously safe. When she scanned the room and saw Karoline sitting in the second row, something changed in her expression, a slight tightening of the jaw, a longer blink between sentences. During a brief intermission, Karoline approached the moderator, a former CNN analyst, and asked if she would be allowed to make her scheduled remarks. "You weren't listed on the revised agenda," he replied, glancing at a clipboard with too many crossed-out names. "But you're welcome to submit your notes." Karoline didn't flinch. "I didn't come to submit. I came to speak." Word spread fast. Staffers whispered. Aides moved closer to Pelosi. And just before the next session resumed, Pelosi leaned toward the moderator and said, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Tell her to step back. This stage isn't hers." It wasn't a request. It was an order. Karoline heard every word. Her eyes didn't shift. Her shoulders didn't sag. She stood still for a moment, not out of hesitation, but intention. Then she stepped forward, and the room started holding its breath. She didn't need a spotlight. She became one. Karoline stepped down the aisle as if it were a courtroom, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble. The panelists seated on stage, most of them carefully vetted policymakers and media-adjacent personalities, exchanged silent glances. The moderator shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly unsure of what he was supposed to do. No one had planned for this. Nancy Pelosi leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing. She'd faced senators, prime ministers, and protesters before, but there was something unsettling about Karoline's calm defiance. It wasn't loud, it wasn't reckless, it was rooted, purposeful. That made it dangerous. As Karoline reached the steps to the podium, a security staffer lightly intercepted her. "Ma'am, I was told," he began, lowering his voice. She met his eyes. "I was told to step back," she said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "But I have a microphone and a message, and unless you want to drag me off this stage, I suggest you let me speak." He hesitated, not because of fear, but because something about the energy in the room had shifted. Half the audience was now filming. The rest were glued to their seats. The security officer stepped aside. Karoline took the podium. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam the desk. Instead, she opened the leather folder she'd brought and placed a single sheet of paper on the podium. It wasn't an op-ed. It wasn't a speech. It was a list of emails, communications between the event organizers and senior staff, emails she'd obtained through a back channel that revealed exactly how and why her name had been erased from the lineup. Sentences like, "She's too divisive. We don't need a MAGA headline today. Make sure her past doesn't include mic access." Karoline read the subject line slowly, then paused. "I'm not here to play victim," she said, scanning the room. "I'm here to remind you that democracy isn't a gated club. You don't get to silence voices you disagree with and call it decorum. That's not what we're built on. That's not what this building stands for." No one interrupted her. Even Pelosi remained still, her polished exterior now rigid. And then Karoline delivered the line that changed the room's temperature completely. "You told me to step back. So I did, to get a better view of who's blocking the door." And with that, she turned the page. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged with discomfort, disbelief, and the distinct feeling that something historic had just cracked open. Karoline hadn't come to deliver a takedown. She came to deliver the truth, and she did it not with fire, but with facts. And that, more than anything, unsettled the room. From the front row, a few attendees shifted in their seats. A younger staffer for a progressive senator whispered, "Did she just say emails?" Another nodded, already searching Twitter. Someone else hit record. But Karoline didn't break stride. She lifted the next page. This one wasn't about her exclusion. It was about the pattern. The forum had quietly removed 2 other conservative voices in the past year under similar pretenses. Karoline had their names, their statements, even screenshots of apology emails sent off the record by junior aides who said, "I'm sorry. We were told to keep it clean, clean." That's how dissent is sterilized. Karoline looked up again. "You don't get to hold forums on democracy while curating the participants like a reality show," she said. "If you only allow voices that already agree with you, you're not holding a conversation. You're performing control." This time, Pelosi whispered something to an aide beside her. The aide nodded and slipped toward the back, likely to consult with organizers or security. But Karoline had already calculated the timing. She knew she had at least a few uninterrupted minutes before someone tried to cut the mic or stage a technical malfunction. So she leaned forward. "This forum claims to be about youth leadership. Well, here's what that actually looks like," she said. "It's not about knowing every answer. It's about being willing to speak when the room doesn't want to listen." A wave of soft murmurs rippled across the audience. This wasn't a conservative rant. It wasn't a campaign stunt. It was a stand. And when Karoline paused, she didn't look at the moderator. She didn't look at Pelosi. She looked into the cameras, straight into the live stream lens, which had started broadcasting 5 minutes earlier on a congressional YouTube feed, and she said, "If they cut this feed, don't worry. I brought my own." The feed did not cut. Not yet. The tension in the room had matured into something heavier, no longer just awkward silence, but a strange, simmering respect. Not everyone agreed with Karoline Leavitt. In fact, many in the audience were openly hostile to her politics. But even they couldn't ignore what they were witnessing. A young woman refusing to yield, armed not with slogans, but receipts. Karoline didn't need to yell. Her control of tone, steady, deliberate, only added weight to each word. And the next one she dropped hit like a hammer. "I want to read a section from the First Amendment," she said, lifting a small pocket constitution from her folder. "Not to educate anyone here, but to remind you that free speech doesn't come with a guest list." She flipped it open and read, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble." She paused, then looked up. "That's not conditional on applause. That's not reserved for the well-liked. That's for everyone." Behind her, a few members of the audience who had been silent began to nod. Even some journalists shifted forward in their seats, sensing the shift in momentum. This wasn't just a rogue speech, this was a reclaiming. Someone backstage must have signaled the AV crew. A red warning light started flashing quietly near the mic base. But Karoline ignored it. She knew what it meant. Wrap it up or be cut. Instead, she doubled down. "I was told I was too controversial to share this stage," she said, looking in Pelosi's direction. "But controversy isn't a crime. Silence, when it's enforced from above, is." And then came the moment that turned the room from stunned to fully electrified. Karoline pulled out a printed copy of the internal email that read, "Remove her from the schedule. This panel is not the place for populist outbursts." She held it up. "Well," she said, "I guess I am the outburst." Laughter, surprised, genuine, broke out across the back rows. A few even clapped. Pelosi didn't move, but her expression, usually unreadable, betrayed something rare. Unease. Karoline smiled softly, not in smugness, but in triumph. She didn't need their approval. She had the truth, and a microphone. And she was just getting started. The applause hadn't been planned. It wasn't loud or theatrical, just a ripple of hands from the back rows, spontaneous and unrehearsed. But in that room, where every gesture was typically calculated, Even a ripple could feel like an earthquake. Karoline didn't bask in it. She acknowledged it with a nod, then returned to her folder. She wasn't here to win a moment. She was here to shift the ground beneath it. "The irony," she said, "is that I came here prepared to speak for 6 minutes. But every barrier you placed in my way, every deletion, every whisper, gave me more to say. You didn't stop me. You fueled me." She set aside the last of her printed evidence, a chain of Slack messages between forum staffers, complete with emoji reactions to her removal. One even said, "LOL, imagine if she actually shows up." Karoline looked up with fire in her eyes. "I imagined it. Then I made it real." The audience was no longer just spectators. They were participants in a moment unfolding faster than any press team could spin. Laptops clacked open. Phones were tilted for a better angle. On Twitter, a clip of Karoline reading the First Amendment had already gone viral under the hashtag #LetHerSpeak. Pelosi shifted in her chair, for the first time visibly uncomfortable. Her chief aide passed her a note. She glanced at it and then glanced at the moderator, who had now gone pale. And yet, no one interrupted, because now the cameras were rolling, and cutting the mic would be a headline in itself. Karoline continued, "I didn't come here to attack anyone, but I will challenge everyone. If you claim to stand for democracy, then prove it when it's inconvenient. That's the test. Not when it's easy, when it's hard." There was an audible breath from someone on the stage. "I may not be your kind of polite," she added, "but I am your kind of American." The crowd let out a low, surprised hum. Applause again, louder this time. And then, she turned her body slightly toward Pelosi, never mentioning her by name, and said, "You told me to step back, but I checked the Constitution. It doesn't say I have to." It wasn't a punchline. It was a verdict, and it echoed louder than any gavel. The moderator finally leaned toward his mic, voice trembling slightly. "Ms. Levitt, your time is—" But he didn't finish. The audience turned their heads, not to listen to him, but to see how Karoline would respond. She raised her hand gently, not in defiance, but with command. "I'm almost done," she said, "but I think the people in this room, and those watching online, deserve to hear this last part." And just like that, the moderator went silent again. Karoline scanned the audience, then pulled out a small card from the inside of her blazer. It was old, clearly worn, and it bore the faded print of her high school's debate team motto. She held it between two fingers. "This," she said, "is where I come from. Not from dynasties, not from donor circles, from a school that had to share textbooks across classrooms and hold fundraisers just to buy new microphones. I wasn't raised to be obedient. I was raised to speak." She placed the card down slowly on the podium, next to the emails and the Constitution. "Maybe some of you think that makes me too raw, too dangerous, too unpredictable." Karoline leaned forward. But the founders of this country weren't polished either. They were loud, uninvited, and very, very inconvenient. A new tension rippled across the panel. But it wasn't defensive anymore. It was introspective. Even some of Pelosi's allies looked down, not out of shame, but contemplation. Because Karoline had just reframed the entire moment. This wasn't rebellion. This was tradition. She turned to the cameras one last time. "To every student watching this, to every person who's ever been told you're not ready, you don't belong, or your voice is too sharp, remember this moment." She tapped the microphone. "They only try to mute what they can't control." And that was it. No grand exit. No cue for music. Karoline closed her folder and stepped back, not waiting for permission, applause, or even acknowledgement. She had spoken, and the room would never be the same. The silence that followed Karoline's final words wasn't absence. It was aftermath. The moderator sat frozen, his next line forgotten. A few audience members blinked as if coming out of a trance, realizing they hadn't just witnessed a speech, but a moment. One of those rare tectonic shifts that couldn't be undone with a press release or a carefully worded follow-up statement. And then, like clockwork, came the reaction. From the far left corner of the stage, a senior Democratic staffer leaned into his headset and whispered furiously to someone backstage. Two security guards stepped into the wings. The event organizer, pale and sweating, began scrolling her phone at lightning speed. Damage control had begun. But Karoline didn't flinch, because she had expected all of it. She had even prepared for the smear that would come later. The anonymous sources, the out-of-context clips, the panelists claiming she had hijacked the moment. She'd prepared not just her message, but her armor. And more importantly, she knew the audience wasn't just in the room anymore. It was the internet. It was the young. It was the ignored. And they were watching. One student stood up, a junior from Arizona State in a faded hoodie. He clapped once, then twice. Then others joined. Not thunderous, not theatrical, but real. The moderator cleared his throat again, this time attempting to regain control. "Miss Levitt, thank you for—" But before he could finish, a voice from the audience called out, "Let her finish!" A few more echoed it, and Karoline, without a moment of hesitation, turned back to the mic. "You invited me to this forum as a symbol. I was supposed to smile, thank you, and sit back down. But I don't do symbolism. I do substance." She raised a final sheet of paper. This one wasn't from a leak or an email. It was a handwritten note from a 15-year-old girl named Dana, whom Karoline had met at a school board rally a month prior. She said, "I'm scared to raise my hand in class. They told me I might offend someone." Karoline let those words hang. "That's why I spoke today. Not to make noise, to make space." And just like that, the power shifted. It wasn't in the moderator's hands, or the cameras, or even the panelists. It was with Karoline, and everyone who had ever been told they were too young, too loud, or too honest to be heard. She folded the letter, tucked it in her blazer, and stepped back one more time. And this time, the audience rose with her. One row, then two. Then the entire right side of the auditorium stood. A full standing ovation. Not because they agreed with everything she said, but because she had said it when she wasn't supposed to. And in that moment, Karoline Levitt didn't just reclaim the mic. She redefined what it meant to own it. The cameras kept rolling, but now they weren't filming an event. They were capturing a shift in narrative power. Outside the auditorium, newsrooms scrambled. Producers yelled across control rooms for footage. Headlines were drafted with lightning speed. Levitt defies panel silence order. Nancy Pelosi challenged by outsider speaker. Karoline Levitt sparks unscripted rebellion at leadership summit. The story had slipped through the cracks of the planned programming. And that was exactly how she wanted it. Back inside, Nancy Pelosi hadn't moved. She sat still, lips pursed, gaze fixed on the table in front of her. For the first time in her political career, it wasn't her voice that shaped the narrative. It was the echo of someone she had tried to dismiss. A nearby mic picked up a staffer, whispering, "Do we respond or let it fade?" Another one replied, "It's already out. Response won't help." Karoline, meanwhile, wasn't even looking at Pelosi anymore. Her focus had shifted. Her eyes scanned the students, especially the girls in the front row, who were now staring back at her not with admiration, but with resolve. Something had ignited in them. A young woman, maybe 19, stood up in the second row and said, "You just said what we've all been thinking." "Thank you," Karoline gave a small smile. Not smug, not triumphant, just full of clarity. "Your voices are next," she replied. "I just cleared the mic." The moderator, sensing the inevitability of the moment, finally leaned into his mic and said, "We'll now open the floor for questions." A pause, then an unexpected gesture. He turned slightly and looked directly at Karoline. "If you'd like to stay on stage for the Q&A, Ms. Levitt, we'd welcome your insight." It was subtle, but the crowd noticed. So did the press. Pelosi's head lifted at that. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Karoline nodded graciously. "I'll take a few." And just like that, she wasn't the uninvited anymore. She was the voice they couldn't move off stage. The first student question was sharp. "You said they tried to make you a symbol. What would you say to those who think you're becoming one anyway?" Karoline didn't hesitate. "Symbols don't speak." "I do." And the room erupted. It was no longer a panel discussion. It was a moment in history, authored live without permission. Karoline looked into the cameras again and said, "This was never about being liked. It was about being heard. And now that I've spoken, I'm not the only one who will. Outside the auditorium, the story had gone nuclear. Within 20 minutes, clips of Karoline's moment at the mic were trending across every platform. TikTok feeds lit up with Gen Z commentary. Twitter, or what remained of it, was ablaze with threads dissecting her every word. On YouTube, independent creators uploaded reaction videos in real time, titling them things like, "She shut the room down," and "Karoline just took the mic from Pelosi," literally. Even those who disagreed with Karoline's politics couldn't ignore the raw authenticity of what had just happened. In one viral post, a progressive college student tweeted, "I don't agree with her, but damn, that was power. That was real." CNN tried to pivot, but their analysts were visibly caught off guard. One guest stuttered through a segment before finally admitting, "We've never seen someone that young, that prepared, and that unshakable." That was historic. Meanwhile, backstage, Pelosi's team huddled in urgent whispers. The former speaker's expression was unreadable, but her silence said it all. For decades, she had dictated the rhythm of Washington discourse. But now, a 20-something from New Hampshire had just rewritten the beat. Inside the venue, Karoline remained seated beside the moderator, not towering over anyone, not trying to dominate, but quietly redefining presence. Students asked her thoughtful, challenging questions, and she answered without evasion. Not with platitudes, but stories. Not with rehearsed lines, but real ones. A young man from a community college asked, "What if they try to silence us after this?" Karoline leaned forward. "They will. But here's the secret. They only win if you believe them. Speak anyway." That line alone traveled across Instagram stories and Reddit threads like wildfire. Suddenly, a staffer rushed in with a phone. "You're being requested live on Fox, and MSNBC wants a statement." Karoline paused, then handed the phone back. "I'm not running a media tour. Let people talk. I already did." It wasn't arrogance. It was discipline. She knew this wasn't the time to chase headlines. The moment itself was the headline. And every second she stayed grounded, it grew stronger. The moderator turned to her again. "Final question?" She nodded. A student stood. "How did you stay so calm up there?" Karoline smiled. "Because I wasn't standing alone." And at that, the crowd rose once more. This time, the clapping wasn't just for what had happened, but for what was coming next. Karoline stepped off the stage not as a guest, not as a disruptor, but as a catalyst. The hallway outside the auditorium was already filling with students, press, and political aides, all scrambling to either catch her for a quote or merely witness what many were now calling the moment. Photographers raised lenses, microphones stretched over shoulders, campaign managers from rival groups took mental notes, but Karoline didn't bask. She didn't break stride. A young girl, no more than 13, stepped out from behind a pillar, holding a notebook to her chest. Her voice trembled. "Ms. Levitt, I want to do what you just did." Karoline stopped, crouched to her level, and said, "Then start now. They only win if we wait." That image of Karoline speaking to the girl in the middle of chaos, cameras, and commotion would become the cover photo for a dozen editorials the next day. Not because of what was said, but because it captured what the political class had missed. This wasn't about Karoline alone. It was about ignition. Back in the green room, Pelosi sat staring at a muted television screen replaying the event. One aide whispered, "Should we issue a response?" Pelosi finally exhaled. "There's no spin that won't make it worse. Just leave it." Karoline, meanwhile, exited through a side door. No entourage, no press handler. Just the night air and 100 thoughts rushing through her mind. Not of victory, but responsibility. She knew what was coming. Backlash, smears, probably a dozen hit pieces before morning. But she also knew something else. She had just broken the fourth wall of American politics. She had looked past the stage, the moderator, even the speaker, and spoken directly to the nation. And that couldn't be undone. By midnight, the clip had surpassed 12 million views across platforms. By dawn, national media was split, half scrambling to discredit her, the other half begrudgingly acknowledging her impact. And in dorm rooms, libraries, campus forums, and community halls across the country, young women were rewatching that moment, studying it, feeling something shift inside, not because Karoline told them what to think, but because she showed them what was possible. She wasn't just heard, she gave others permission to speak, and that, more than any headline, would be her legacy from that night. They told her to sit down. She stood up. They tried to cut the mic. She spoke louder. They said she didn't belong. She made the moment hers. Karoline Leavitt didn't come to play by their rules. She came to remind them that the voice of the people doesn't wait for permission. And if they try again to push her back, she'll just step forward again. Thanks for watching. And remember, in a world of staged silence, the truth never whispers. It roars. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you believe in voices that rise when they're told to shrink.